Hi, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I've got an amazing guy with me who's sort of woken up in his hotel room, not quite sure where he is. We all know that feeling. David Weill is joining us. I hope I said that name correctly. He'll tell me in a minute.
Yeah,
But
you did.
I certainly empathise with when I'm travelling. What day is it? What time is it? And sort of, I think we can all empathise with that one. And I'm really grateful that you're joining us. Just to remind folks, this is a pre-recorded show. But if you have any questions, do WhatsApp me on 07506 319 745. And if you've got any questions for David, I'll pass them on. I'm sure he'll be happy to sort of answer any questions. But don't call me during the show because I'll probably be in bed. Because it's recorded in advance. So that's enough of me. David is a surgeon. He's going to tell us about what he does, but he's written some very interesting books about his own personal history and also about some of the psychological aspects of transplant as well and how people experience that. And we're going to delve into that. But first of all, David, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. I am traveling, so I figured out where I am. I'm actually in Boston today, so that's good.
Well done. Well remembered. That's good. It's always the first step when you're traveling is where am I? What
That's
time is
that's
it?
right. That's right.
We all know that feeling in this day and age as well. We're so interconnected, aren't we? It's really
Yes, and
quite extraordinary. And also, I think post-pandemic, I now really value the fact that I can travel, I can go anywhere in the world again, because it was quite a frightening experience. Where you're based in Louisiana, not in the
I
whole.
no,
Um,
I live in New Orleans, and I grew up there actually, and was gone for 27 years, and moved back a half dozen years ago, back to my hometown. So I've
can
got
you
New
speak
Orleans in my
French as
blood.
well as English? Are you
No,
bilingual?
no, unfortunately not. There's a lot of French influences in the town,
Yes.
but I don't speak any French.
Is it commonly spoken? I always think that in that part of the world, French is quite common, but it's not, I guess.
No, it's not. If you go out into the more rural areas of Louisiana, you see sort of an English slash French dialect called Cajun,
Okay, yeah,
and
yeah,
it has elements of French and English in it. It's an interesting dialect.
yeah, yeah. Interesting part of the world. We only know it through films. What was it like growing up in, as it were?
I loved growing up there. I got exposed to so many different things. Great culture there. There's the music culture. I'm a big jazz fan, so it's hugely interesting to me to hear live music there. The
Yeah,
food is fantastic. The architecture is very interesting.
yeah,
There's a lot of writers that come from the New Orleans area.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
very sensual place, and I think it's
yeah.
very thought provoking.
Yeah, that's the impression I get. I was saying to you before the show, a friend of mine is working on the London Jazz Festival and has been negotiating with the state capital in Louisiana with some of the government officials to get some of the musicians over because that's sort of how we know it in the UK as this place with very vibrant, alive culture. And also, to some extent, as a place that is the sort of magical thinking and things like that. And I don't know if that still informs the sort of culture there.
I think so, and I think one of the mottos of New Orleans is, and this is the only French I know, which is "Laissez le bon temps rouler," which
Okay,
is let the good times roll. And
right.
I think it's very much a culture, European in many ways, where you don't work to live.
Yeah, yeah,
Life is more than just your job. It's actually all the elements that go along with a
yeah.
happy, productive life. And so I've always sort of, tried to incorporate that into my own thinking about my own work.
Yeah,
Sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
no, no, absolutely. But it is interesting, I think, and folks in Europe don't understand. So can you see that thumb coming up? I don't know why these sort of new apps now they recognize your hand signals and mirror them for some strange reason. Um, but I think, my experience of America is it's very, very work driven. I mean, it's like to the point of pathological. I think it's sort of like
I,
doesn't
yeah.
seem very healthy to me. But you
No,
grew up in a different type of culture, right?
yeah, I did. And, I didn't really appreciate it at the time because it's all you know when you're growing up is your
Yeah,
hometown. But then when I started to move around, I realized that the culture was very different, especially on the East and West Coast of
yeah,
the United States, where it's very fast paced, it's very production oriented, productivity oriented.
yeah.
And even in California, where I spent most of my career, I
Nice.
think some people would think of California as kind of laid back, and I didn't find that at all. I
No,
actually,
not at all.
particularly where I lived in the San
Yeah.
Francisco Bay Area, it
Mm.
was very much about productivity.
Yeah, yeah. That's my experience, and it's really in your face as well in terms of business and getting. It's got an interesting energy, but it's very different to, as you say, the European one. So you became a surgeon, but was that sort of normal in your family? Was that sort of what you grew up with, a medical background?
Yeah, my father was a pulmonologist, so a lung specialist, just like I am. And he was more research oriented, where I was more clinically oriented, so taking care of patients. And I developed an interest in lung transplant. My mother was a pediatric ICU nurse. And so
Right.
I came from a medical background, and I used to round with my father in the hospital when I was little and was around medicine all my life. I worked in hospitals when I
Really?
was
Yeah.
as a teenager and in college, and
Right.
I really always wanted to be a doctor.
What attracted you apart from copying your parents? What can you remember why at an early age? I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I love hospitals myself, having worked in them from the psychological side of things. They are incredibly powerful places. I mean, they really are.
Yeah, I actually like the hospital environment too. I know some people cringe when they walk into a hospital, but
Yeah,
I feel very comfortable there. I started working in the hospitals when I was 15 years old and have always felt very comfortable there. There's a lot of people around, there's a lot of teamwork involved.
yeah,
I think you get to see things that I don't think other people get to see. And this is what I spend a lot of time writing about is some of the experiences I had doing this kind of work. And I think the best part about it is how much you learn about people.
mm,
Not only the patients you're caring for, but you also learn about the people that you work with, and you learn
yeah,
a lot about
yeah,
yourself as
yeah,
well
yeah.
in these moments. So I find that environment endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I was my first post qualification, my first real job was in a psych ward in a hospital, acute ward. And it was amazing experience. I have to say, not for the patients. I mean, they're coming in disturbed and upset, but as a professional, that teamwork thing in particular, being part of a team of people who were really clever and knew their stuff was really exciting, to be honest.
I think so too, and I think that particularly when I was at Stanford, there was a very large team involved. There was more than 50 people on the team, and it was energizing in a lot of ways. And there's human interactions and dynamics that aren't so functional, but
Yeah.
at the same time it was a very real experience, and I never had trouble getting out of bed and going to the
No,
hospital. That
it's
was
like the
easy.
same here actually. It was self-motivating. And in fact, I was yesterday I was doing another recording for the podcast, which is the one that's going out this evening, the evening that we're doing this recording on, of two medical doctors who one of whom is now in the Lords in the UK, and he's just written a book about saving the NHS, and he was head of the NHS and stuff like that. And another who's a junior doctor who's just started. You remember being a junior doctor just starting, and
I do. I do.
um, and we were talking about exactly that sort of immersion into the clinical world and how exciting it is, sort of being part of that. You've got a sort of interesting and I think relevant background in terms personal background, in terms of what we're going to be sort of focusing on, the sort of psychological aspects of this work, what it does to yourself and how patients experience these things and these issues. You come from, is it a Jewish background, a sort of background in,
Well, it was an ambiguous background, to be
was it?
honest with you. It was so my father was a Holocaust survivor, a German uh, Jew who came to America in 1939 and had all the persecution that goes along with that. His family certainly experienced that, and we have a German heritage going back 600 years, actually, a pretty long family history. But my mother was a Southern Baptist woman, and anybody familiar with this southern part of the United States knows how deeply religious the folks are, particularly the Christian folks. And
Mhm.
so she came from a small town in Alabama called Selma, which was known for its civil rights.
Yeah, I remember.
Um,
Yes, there's a film of that name, isn't there, as well?
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So I, I did not grow up with much, or with any really formal religion in my life. And I actually am writing a third book now that's going to focus on religious identity. And so
Yes.
I'm exploring all of this rather deeply right now.
Yes. Well, so was that because your parents decided that religion would not feature, and they were in the sciences and medics, and which often
The,
does actually happen?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Both of them turned their back on religion for different reasons. My father, because of the persecution of the Jews in Europe, and then my mother, because of what she thought was the civil rights movement not being paid attention to by the
Yeah.
church. In other words, not an acceptance that all God's children are created equally. And so she turned her back on her religion. And so when we were young, they really asked us whether or not we wanted religion in our life. And of course, as small children, we were like, no, I don't think so.
I'll live without that, thanks.
I'll live without it. And
Yeah.
it kind of it followed me around though. It haunted
Did
me
it?
a little bit not having religion. And so my next book project is going to be about exploring the impact that had on me and how it all unfolded.
It's difficult to negotiate an absence. It's psychologically, it's quite a challenging thing. I had religion. I come from an Irish background.
Mhm.
Both my parents are Irish, and so there were real issues about religion. That sort of like as I was growing up, as there was still an active war going on,
Right.
ostensibly around religion, sort of, and religious conflict. And I do remember going to church as a Catholic as a boy. I remember enjoying it, to be honest, because in those days it was still very much high church, so smells and bells and sort of incantations and all that sort of stuff, which as a kid was just fascinating. I mean, I loved
Yeah.
it bits, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, when I spent most of my life really dreading the question when somebody would ask me what religion I am. I didn't have a good answer, so
Right.
it's something that I've struggled with.
Is it particularly an issue in the US? Because we look at the news and we think maybe there's some issues over there, because the UK is very secular in its approach, but
I think it's particularly an issue in the southern part of the United
right,
States. It seems like the rest of the country is not as focused on religion as the South is, but I think in the southern part of the U.S. it's more of an issue, and I think all religions are accepted, but
right.
saying you don't have one is not accepted as well, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite,
Uh,
and it's you would stand out. And did you stand out as a kid in that way when people would talk about their religious beliefs or use the word God and things like that?
yeah, it made me uncomfortable because I think, especially growing up in New Orleans, there was a very strong, waspy kind of background.
Yeah,
Christianity. There's a Catholic church really on every corner
right,
in New Orleans. It's a very
right.
Catholic city. And then, yet it also had many multi-generational Jewish families,
Did it
some of
really? Oh, I
whom,
didn't know that.
yeah, it did. A lot of Jews settled in the South and were in various occupations,
Okay.
trades, and merchants, and things of that sort. And so there's a very strong multi-generational Jewish community in New Orleans, but I really wasn't part of that either. So I was sort of a man without without a real island, you know.
And is the Jewish community is it very visible? Its practices.
It is. There's a few prominent synagogues in
Right.
New Orleans. There's many Jewish societies, and
Okay.
it's very much a part of the fabric of the city, and probably lesser known than the Catholicism is in New Orleans because it's, you know, a very like I said, a very Catholic city. It's
Oh,
Louisiana is very Catholic. We don't have counties in our state. We have parishes in our state.
wow.
So
It's okay. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's
I get it. And that would
yeah,
be part of the the early French influence as well. The Catholicism definitely would have been
that
important in that way.
that's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Although ostensibly France is again a non-religious state, is very Catholic. It's still sort of like
right.
and sort of yeah, whatever. And so interestingly, so your parents, for their own reasons, and I'm guessing I don't want to talk about them. We don't need to, but for reasons that might be thought of as quite traumatic, didn't go into this stuff. They chose to go into science and medical and healing, which is often a motivator for people who want to become healers. That's often that they're dealing with stuff, and so there's nothing wrong with that. It just is a fact that quite often people are. And do you think that's what was going on there with your family?
Oh, sure. Yeah, definitely. And I think that you know, for this third book that I'm writing, I'm also exploring inherited trauma and things of
Right.
that nature, and especially focusing on Holocaust, the children of Holocaust survivors, the so-called second generation.
Yeah.
And most of us gravitate towards something that makes us feel connected, makes us feel like we are healing people. Some of us, and I think I put myself in that category,
Yeah.
seek gratitude and acceptance from other people, and a natural thing to do is go into the healing arts because
Yeah.
really every day one of the beautiful things about, you know, what I do is every day somebody tells you thank you or
Yeah.
expresses gratitude in some other way
Yeah.
for what you've done.
Yeah. And particularly you've chosen, it's a really, really difficult job that you've got these sort of major transplants of a huge organs, lungs are huge, complicated things, and so are hearts, etc. And that's I mean, that's your top-notch surgeon if you're in that field, and it's such a complicated job. But I coming back to the inherited trauma and your understanding of it. And I think it's much misunderstood, this thing. And I know that part of my motivation for becoming psychologically aware and helping people psychologically was because I was trying to deal with some of the inherited stuff from my own parents' background and their parents' background, etc. And I understand some of the genetics of that as well. And I guess you do. But it's very interesting. I mean, the trauma in my family was very obvious. There was no way of escaping it. The alcoholism was there, the dysfunctional relationships. There was still a violent struggle going on in Ireland, etc., etc. In terms of your own family, though, I guess that was your father one of those guys who, as a survivor of the Holocaust, he just didn't want to talk about this stuff and it was never discussed, or was he more open about it?
No, he didn't want to talk about it. And in fact, I tried to pry information out of him, and
Right.
it was tough going. And he really, throughout his entire life, didn't really want to talk about it. And he certainly was not the kind of person that would make excuses about, you know, his life because he was very successful, and you
Yeah.
know, he, I think, got everything he wanted out of life. But he didn't really want to talk about it. So I'm actually going through a process where I'm learning more about what happened to my family and going back even hundreds of years
Yes.
through my own research than I did in any personal conversations with my father or my grandfather for that matter.
Fascinating. I was talking to a slightly older lady. She was on one of my other shows, and she was talking about her maternal grandmother who was from Ireland and had moved from Ireland during part of the relocations, large relocations of of 100 years ago or something close to that. And her grandmother was very damaged by her experiences in Ireland, and as a grandmother, she had a very difficult relationship with her. She became a nurse, this woman, interestingly, and went into the medical profession like a lot of people do. And she's gone back now and learned something about her grandmother's childhood, her growing up, her journey, and it's reframed everything for her. So she's no longer finding it a difficult relationship in her mind. And it seems to be a very healing process for people. Are you finding that as well, that you're sort of getting some insight into the situation?
Very, very much so. I mean, it helps me really understand where both of my parents were coming from, and particularly my father, who wasn't somebody that was going to talk about what was on his mind
Yeah.
necessarily, especially about emotional things. He wasn't that kind of person. He and I had wide-ranging discussions about a number of things, particularly things that were going on in the world and about medicine,
Okay.
but not so much about how he felt growing up in the situation that he did. He wasn't the kind of person that wanted to talk about that.
And you indicate you have a sibling as well, is that right?
Yeah, I have two older sisters.
Okay. And are they in the healing professions, or did they go another?
No, no, they went another route. I'm
Okay.
the only doctor in the family or nurse. I am married to a nurse though,
Oh, yeah.
so we're continuing that. But my two daughters are not going into medicine.
Are
So
they not? What do they
no,
plan to do with their lives? Something very different.
one on wants to become a journalist, and one is in communications. So
Right. That's
the
fantastic.
written and spoken word.
Wonderful. It's great. It's great. I really like young people these days. I find them very exciting, really interesting world that they are creating. And it's how do you think, if you think back now, beginning this research, sort of what sort of impact did this inherited trauma have upon you? And I don't mean this in any sort of negative sense, just in sense of what are your feelings and thoughts about it, particularly because the generation of fathers that you and I had weren't talking about stuff anyway. Sort of, they were not given those words. The emotional sort of language was not there, and also many of them went through quite hellish things as well, because that was a really difficult time in the world. So, what do you think was the sort of impact of this inherited trauma, and also of a lack of conversation about it in particular?
I think that in me, it led me toward constantly feeling like I belong, proving that I belong. I wanted acceptance. I would classify myself as a gratitude junkie.
Okay.
I wanted patients to tell me that I saved their lives, and I really liked that. And feeling that I was having a positive influence, that people looked at me as someone who was doing something important. I
Right.
think all of those things came from my parents' experience, and I think it's that kind of internal drive to really feel like you're doing something important and you're accepted in the world, even though my father particularly was not accepted, for
Yeah.
who he was and what kind of religion he practiced when he was a boy.
Yeah.
And I think that does get passed down to generations.
Cool. And it's also, did he ever, I'm just wondering, I don't know if he's still alive, but did he ever reconcile himself with his cultural background at any point?
No, I don't think he ever did. He passed
No.
away around 11 years ago, and
Okay.
I don't think he found that kind of spirituality that I found in my life later in my life, and I don't think he ever found that. I think that men of his generation were not used to talking about their own
No.
emotions, their own spirituality, what's on
Yeah.
their mind.
Yeah.
We live in a society now where there's a lot more sharing, perhaps oversharing, but we certainly live in that kind of society now.
Yeah, I wouldn't say oversharing, but then
Yeah,
I guess I would never say that, would I?
right, right, right,
But
right,
sort of,
right.
it's not in my interest to talk about shutting down. But certainly, if I ponder for myself, I recently, within the last year or so, decided to get my Irish nationality formalised. I was born Irish because I was born of two Irish parents in England, and there's been a complicated relationship between England and Ireland for many years.
Yeah.
But also one of those complications was my rejection of that identity. I was not comfortable with it growing up, definitely not. A lot to do with my difficult relationship with my father, and I often rejected that. I found the violence of that culture that very, very complicated and difficult, not something I could identify with. But recently, I went and applied for my Irish citizenship and got my passport, and I now travel on that. And in a sense, I feel like that is a very real way in which I'm embracing and getting over and healing from that past. Are you there as well? Is that the sort of thing that's happening for you in terms of your maybe your Jewish identity as well as your Baptist identity? I don't know about where that fits as well.
Yeah, I feel like I'm getting close to having it at age 60 now, fully sorted out.
Okay.
It took a long time, it took a long time, and for me, writing about it is important. It helps me understand what I'm thinking and going through. Reading about it helps me. Talking with other people about it has helped me. And so I'm very keen to continue this work with this book project that I'm doing right
Yeah, I
now
look forward to it
because
coming
it,
out. I'd love to read it, to be honest, David. I mean, I'm
yeah,
such a
yeah,
fascinating brave human experience.
it'll be out probably in late 2025, and I think it's really helped. I think it really has helped me understand, where I came from and
Yeah,
what impact all of that, the people that preceded me, had on me. I think it's important that we all do that, but I think in my
I agree.
situation, it's been
I
very
agree.
important.
And I think it's also just so that people understand why it's important. Trauma is epigenetic, as you know. It's one of those, or stress rather, is epigenetic, but trauma is an extreme version of stress. And stress and trauma change our genetic makeup. That's what happens, particularly the end of our DNA strands, the telomeres, etc., are influenced by this. But also, traumatic events are encoded within the amygdala, which is our fight flight sort of threat mechanism. And that can be passed on through the matrilineal line and the patrilineal line through conception, etc. So, and the way we deal with these things, the way we change that epigenetic cost, and epigenetic just means we'll have a response, a patterned response to something, and it may activate, in terms of psychology, it may activate things like addiction, depression, psychosis have been linked to it as well. So quite severe consequences, as well as other issues, biological, medical issues around hypertension, organ tissue problems. And it's interesting you went into organ tissue transplant. So it can have quite a significant impact biologically and intergenerationally. And actually, one of the ways that we reduce the danger of these impacts or ameliorate them is through exactly what David's describing, which is to go and find out about it. Because our mind and body has amazing healing capacities through self-knowledge. It's extraordinary.
I couldn't agree more with all of what you said. It's
Yeah.
spot on.
Yeah, I mean, people really need to understand this stuff. The psychological project these days is very much evidence-based. Um, Unlike the early days of psychology, I don't think it was particularly evidence-based. Sort of like just pin the tail on the donkey mostly, to be honest.
Right.
I'm not a great fan of that approach. Um, so, which is why I want to dwell on this, because I think it's really important people understand that the medical, the psychological, the biological, the psychological, they're not two separate things.
Right.
They're absolutely the same thing, And when you have a thought, you're having a biological process. When you're having a feeling, you're having a biological process. Can we look back a little bit into coming to the transplant surgery? Because I think there's some really interesting stuff there. Not necessarily the training. I mean, for people who don't know, David has been at some of the top institutions, a really top of your game, sort of leading the field, and that I think is really important. But it's also, I think, it seems to me what you've done is you've thought very deeply about these experiences and these processes, as well as just become technically brilliant in your field. Would that be fair to say?
I, one thing that I think that, as I was learning how to do my job and
Yeah,
as I
yeah,
did my job, what was never lost on me is the amazement of it. I
yeah,
walked around in the hospital for 25 years and almost wanted to look over my shoulder and tell somebody, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?
yeah, yeah,
Isn't
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah. No, I know that.
incredible?" Because it seemed like every day, you know, we I was seeing something that I wanted to either write about or tell somebody about or affected me profoundly,
Yeah,
just because of what you run into from an ethical, moral, societal standpoint. You're making decisions that I think are life and death, but you're also bringing your own value system to that decision making process, and you're learning about what other people value. In fact, I used to ask patients that were coming to see me for a transplant surgery, what would you do if today was your last day?
yeah, right.
And the reason I asked them that is not because I was looking for any particular answer, but I really wanted to know what that individual valued, why they wanted to get this big life-saving surgery, why they wanted to keep on living. And people told me all kinds of different things that really impacted the way I think about my own life.
Yeah,
And to me, that was the job that was every bit as important and interesting as the technical aspects of doing the work.
yeah. Amazing. I mean, I'm still in awe of my time in hospital. When you're saying I was looking for that person to say, "Do you get it?" I remember that feeling really clearly. It was just, it was extraordinarily impressive, and I still have that thing when I go to hospitals today, whatever reason I'm going to them, that there's something about in the very brickwork of the hospital. It's extraordinary, and like talking to these doctors yesterday, and to some extent, I'm quite sad in the UK at the moment. We seem to have lost our deep respect for things like the NHS, etc.,
Mhm.
which I find really, really upsetting, genuinely deeply upsetting. We need to get back to that and really love what we have done because healing is so important. And in terms of, I mean, I'm struck as well. I mean, one thing that struck me in my practice in hospitals and still does in my practice with patients now is the resilience and strength of human beings in the face of really frightening stuff and how amazing people are. Right.
I think I couldn't agree more. I mean, the courage that my patients showed just to continue living
Yeah.
was inspiring to me. It made me also think about my own life and
Right.
try not to sweat the little things,
Yeah. Yeah.
getting caught up in traffic or whatever it is, because these patients had really figured out what really is most important, what really matters. And in the conversations I had with those folks, they didn't talk about work or they didn't talk about that annoyance or that grievance or the other. They talked about the relationships that they had with family and friends.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think it really helped me reorder my own priorities, more in keeping with my own values, just by talking with patients. I mean, they gave me uh, as much, if not more, than I gave them.
I wonder if your dad was getting that as well, sort of, because I can imagine that. I don't know your father, I don't want to use him in this way, but having met people who've had overwhelmingly traumatic experiences, which are, incomprehensible to most of us, finding purpose and meaning again in life is a really tough thing to do when you've been faced with Holocaust. Let's use that word. And I wonder if your father was finding that purpose and meaning as well in the courage of his patients.
I think he did. And one thing that was interesting about my father's career is he was very much a scientist at heart. He was a
Okay,
physician, certainly, but more of a scientist than a physician. And he ended up not really having a lot of interaction with patients because he was a
right.
research scientist. And I think that while that was very good for him and it was in keeping with his personality, it wasn't for me.
Right.
I very much wanted the energy that the patients gave to me and the education they gave me.
Well,
But he was, I think very interested in pursuits of the mind
Okay.
rather than of the emotion,
Yeah,
if
because the
that makes
emotions would
sense.
have been quite challenging, I should
Yes,
imagine.
yes,
But one has respect for that. I really do. How people survive is how they survive, and that
right.
really needs to be treated with deep respect, I think, and not, challenged as right or wrong. So thinking about some of those issues about relationship, and I'm trying to, because I know, in a sense, I've been in that type of environment. Maybe the people watching and listening don't, but I think the closest we can get to looking at these fundamental issues of meaning purposes to take people's minds back to the beginning of the pandemic and when we were beginning to lock down. And there was, without fail, and everybody I talked to did exactly this thing. Um, I did, and I think everybody I knew started to call all those people we hadn't spoken to in many years just to check in. I'm rather embarrassed about it. We're both smiling about it. Just want to see if you're all right. We're all doing it because it was like that was what became important, was those connections that we have to other human beings. You're smiling. You did exactly the same, I guess.
I did, and as much as we like to complain about Zoom, it was fantastic during the pandemic, just because you really could connect with other human beings, have a glass of wine, do all the kind of things we were doing during the pandemic, and I frankly can't imagine,
Yeah.
what pandemics were like in the 1917, 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, when there was very little ability to connect.
Well,
We
actually, broke the law, if I remember rightly. People broke the law, went to church. That's what happened. They went to
I,
synagogue, church, and they hung out in groups together, and they ignored the police telling them not to, which was why it was worse, actually.
I think that's right. I mean, we
Yeah,
at least had the benefit of having connection, cell phones, and Zoom
yeah,
meetings and things
yeah.
of that sort.
And certainly these interactions, electronic interactions, we're using Zoom. There are other ones, of course. Um,
Right.
they've transformed my profession because, and I think like my profession, which is psychology and psychological health, there were big debates prior to the pandemic about whether you could do therapy properly online. And then all the people that had been against it changed their minds.
Yeah, I bet that's true.
Overnight, absolutely. Suddenly there were models of practice for everything.
That's right. That's right.
And so, but I mean, I've been involved in online stuff for many years, and we have an organization in the UK called the Samaritan, are an organization that deal with people with suicidal attempts and stuff. And they've always been telephone based. They've been going for 80 years, So they demonstrated a long time ago you can do things telephonically. Um, so we that's just right to try and get people to understand, I guess, what it means to be in a life and death environment, which is where you have worked all of your life. You've been working in a life and death environment and managing that thing. And it's what would you say, and you had a father who come from a life and death environment, and here you were managing it, if you like. So one can think about it in those terms. What would you be for you as somebody who's watched people, helped people survive, faced people in that sort of fear of death, etc. What would be the sort of profound or not so profound lessons that you like? You said one, which was, I don't sweat the small stuff anymore. What else do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. I think getting rid of our more petty instincts, frankly,
Yeah,
is an important lesson that I learned. But probably the most important lesson is connection.
right.
I think that, especially in today's world, with all the different ways we can isolate ourselves, I think that staying connected to one another has is always been important, but it is more important now than ever. And I think patients in particular that were facing life and death taught me that
Yeah,
very early on, that it, if there was the prospect that they were leaving this earth, they were very much concerned about the people they were leaving behind,
yes,
not the job they were leaving behind, or not the material objects they were leaving behind, but the people they were leaving behind.
yeah.
And that was never really lost on me. So I do the best I can to try to stay connected to my friends and my family. And sometimes I'm better than that than others, but I think that that's something that we should all strive for.
And I'm just interested if you have some thoughts on, because there's an emergent field around the psychology of transplant patients,
Yeah.
partly because it's still relatively new. I mean,
Yes.
transplant surgery has leapt forward hugely, but I still remember the first heart transplant. It's within my lifetime, right?
Right.
So, do you have any thoughts about that? Because there is certainly, we were talking just before the show about the heart in particular has executive functioning. It is its own mind, as it were. And I'm interested to know what you think about that in terms of the psychology of the surviving transplant patient and the connections that seem to be merging with, the parents of the son that died in the car crash, whose organs are then given to somebody else, etc. There's a whole new emergence, I think, of psychology there.
Yeah, and I got lucky because I worked with a transplant psychiatry group at
Wow.
Stanford who was really pioneering this
Wow.
effort. And in particular, Dr. Jose Maldonado and
Yeah, yeah,
Dr.
yeah,
Lisa
yeah.
Scher were colleagues of mine, friends of mine,
That's extraordinary.
who really opened my
Hey,
eyes.
you've worked with some really cool people.
I have. I mean,
Really, seriously, amazing.
these are brilliant people
Yeah,
that as a transplant practitioner, made me aware of the complexity of the transplant psychology,
yeah,
not only when it comes to evaluating who is and who would not be a good psychosocial candidate for the
yeah,
procedure, but also what happens to the people after we transplant them. And I think that work is fascinating. There's not only survivor's guilt, but there's also um, a difficult relationship with the organ donor that somebody had to
yeah,
die in order for me to live, and that
yeah.
kind of thing. But I agree with you totally. I think that field is endlessly fascinating.
And have you got any anecdotes from it in terms of people meeting up that sort of struck you in particular?
Yeah, it happened pretty frequently where patients could arrange to meet their donor family through an
Right.
intermediary, and the experiences were unbelievable. I saw them happen live. I heard about them. I read the letters that were exchanged back and forth, and there's just profound gratitude that somebody's made at the worst time of their life a decision to donate their loved one's organs and
Yeah,
make this incredible gift. And I think those relationships sometimes go on for decades,
yeah,
and it's a connection. When a patient of mine was walking around with a heart or a lung from somebody else, and that body part was alive in
yeah,
somebody else,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
I think the families that lost that loved one took real comfort in that. I think real comfort, and I was witness to it, and I'll never forget it.
yeah. And also the survivor, the transformation of their life, and sort of getting to a deep sense of what's important. And I guess the way they treasure their life going forwards, and the effort they put into their health and well-being. I guess I'm one of the reasons I have for sort of spending a little bit of time on this is because I just want to encourage people to fill in that organ donor card. It is
Yeah,
an
yes,
extraordinary thing to do.
yeah. It is. It's an amazing thing, and still, in the United States at least, it's still about a 50-50 proposition. About 50% of the people consent to donation,
Right.
50% don't.
Yeah.
So we still lose a lot of potentially transplantable organs. So I share in your call to
Yeah.
please consider donating your
Well, I
loved one's
guess I'd
organs.
put it stronger than that. Like if you're listening to this, the first thing I wanted to do when this show is finished is fill in that donation card. That's the first thing I wanted to do. Is
Perfect.
really important stuff. And go give blood if you haven't given blood recently. Go and do that. You'll save lives, very definitely. Which is another part of that. I mean, it's become more normal for people to give their bodies away, and we should really think about it in those terms. So it's an amazing field that you've been in, impossible to summarize in any way. And one thing that strikes me is that you are continuing to grow and develop as a human being, and set yourself new challenges and tasks, such as the new book that you're working on. What is the current book, so that people know what it's called and how to get hold of it?
So there's a book coming out in June that I wrote. It's my second one. It's called All That Really Matters, and it's a
Yeah.
novel set in the transplant world, in that
Right.
my protagonist is a heart transplant surgeon, but the story is not about transplant. The story is about love and loss and redemption and
Yeah.
sacrifice. All the themes that we've been talking about today
Right.
show up in fiction, and I think fiction is a great way to tell some of these stories.
Yeah.
I wrote a memoir also that came out in 2021 called Exhale, about my own personal emotional ups and downs with doing this kind of work. But I found in my second book that it was really great to explore some of these themes even more thoroughly using fiction as a tool in
Yeah.
storytelling.
And I think the arts are a natural place to look at these things. My first job was in theatre, actually, and
Mm.
that's how I processed a lot of these things. So I'm very connected to the creative aspect of these, and it's not often thought of that people who work in the sciences are also very creative individuals, and particularly in the medical sciences. And you beginning to write a third book, did you say?
Yeah, I'm in the midst of writing a third book that'll be out in 2025 that is not titled yet, but will
Oh,
cover issues of identity, and particularly
wonderful.
religious identity.
Do you have a website or a place where people can see these resources and maybe book you in if they want talks and things like that?
Uh,
Or
yeah, I do. It's pretty simple. It's just davidweill.com. So
right,
David, Weill.com.
okay, we'll make sure when the show goes out that there's a link there. The books are on available on Amazon, I presume,
They are. Yeah, they are.
and so people can have them ordered. And do you have any sort of particular events coming up at the moment? Do you talk about this public events and sort of give lectures?
I do, and all of that will be on my website. I'm doing a swing through California next week, and San Francisco and LA, and doing a number of
Wonderful,
events there. And then
wonderful.
I'll continue to do those through the summer and into the fall. And one thing I've learned after my first book came out is how busy the period is actually talking about the book afterwards, which
Yeah, yeah.
it's fun. It's fun, but it's busy.
It's tiring. You wake up in hotel rooms going,
Yep.
where am I today?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Well, look, if you're ever over in London, do look me up and I'll take you out for a nice coffee somewhere.
I will. I will. I actually spent, I didn't mention this during the conversation, but I spent 6 months during my fourth year of medical school in London working at the Brompton Hospital there.
Oh, nice. That's a nice one.
Um, so
Yeah.
I got a close-up view of the National Health Service and British medicine, and it was
But you understand why I
fascinating.
think it's precious, don't you? It
Yeah,
is.
I do.
We are insane in this country at the moment. We seem to be letting it go. And it's just bonkers. But there's a counter move towards us understanding just how precious it is. So I think we're beginning to fight back and let people know. David, it's just been absolutely wonderful for me to talk to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've
Uh,
sort of
Very, very much so. I appreciate the conversation.
yeah.
Thank you. It's
I
been
think
great.
it's just people don't understand that health professionals, the complex motivations that we have, and the backstory of all of us is really, I haven't yet met a health professional who isn't absolutely fascinating as a human being, and actually dealing with these incredibly important existential questions about identity, meaning, purpose, life, death. It's our bread and butter, and it's a real honor and privilege to be around that, I think. You stay there. I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody. What a wonderful show. What a wonderful guest. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, contact details will be underneath the video. And I'm sure if you've got questions for Dave and I pass them on to, he'd be delighted to answer your questions. Do go and read his books. And I hope you get a greater insight into the mind of healing professionals and health professionals from reading his work. Lovely to have you here, David. You stay there. Bye bye for now, everybody.